On a cold February morning in 1953, on a quiet street in Memphis, fire engines lined up neatly in front of a 3-story house. They were not there to save it. They were there to burn it, not under cover of darkness, not in secret, but in broad daylight, before a gathered crowd. The official reason sounded harmless enough: a public demonstration of a new firefighting technology, a modern fog nozzle, said to extinguish fires faster than anything that had come before. But to prove that claim, they needed something to destroy, and the city chose a 3-story Queen Anne mansion, 14 rooms, once among the most beautiful private homes in Memphis. Tall bay windows, intricate, carved wood, hand-painted murals imported from Italy, a house that had stood for nearly 70 years. When the flames rose, the crowd watched in silence. Wood burned, murals vanished, rooms that had once held a family's life were consumed in a matter of hours. Black newspapers later called it an act of infamy. One local resident said the scene resembled a lynching, not of a person, but of a symbol, because what burned that day was not just a house. It was the last visible trace of something this city had struggled to tolerate for decades. And the real question is not why the house was burned. The question is why it was never allowed to keep standing. To understand why a city would use fire, technology, and the cover of legality to erase a symbol in plain sight, we have to go much further back than the house itself. Back to a boy born without the right to exist, who went on to build something an entire system of power could not endure. If you want to understand the true story behind that fire, keep watching. And if you care about the histories that were meant to be forgotten, remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Robert Reed Church was born in 1839 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. He was born into slavery at a time when a black child was not recognized as a person in any legal record, no official surname, no civic rights, no guaranteed future. His mother, Emmeline, was an enslaved seamstress. Her work was to make clothing for others, while she herself did not own her own life. Robert's father was a wealthy white man, the owner of luxurious steamboats that traveled the Mississippi River between Memphis and New Orleans. He never publicly acknowledged Robert as his son. Under the law of the time, Robert was not his father's child. He was property. According to stories passed down within the family, Emmeline was said to carry Malagasy ancestry, believed to be a descendant of a princess captured and sold into slavery. There is no official documentation confirming this. Historians generally regard it as family oral tradition, but the significance of the story lies not in whether it was literally true, but in what it reveals about how the church family understood themselves. Even in bondage, they believed they possessed dignity, and Emmeline passed that belief to her son. Robert received no formal education, no structured training. There was no path laid out for social standing or wealth. In that system, a boy like Robert was meant to disappear quietly, but he did not disappear. Robert's childhood unfolded in a strange in-between state. He existed physically, but not legally. Not a plantation slave in the traditional sense, yet not free in any meaningful way. He lived close to power, without ever being allowed to touch it. That proximity was unusual. His father never acknowledged him, but he also did not send him away. Instead, he kept Robert near his steamboats. Robert began with the lowest tasks, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, clearing tables. The work was hard, repetitive, and offered no visible escape. But those boats did not carry only cargo. They carried money. They carried influence. They carried some of the wealthiest men in the American South. And Robert saw everything. He watched how they spoke to one another, how decisions were made, how a single handshake could be worth thousands of dollars at a time when a black laborer might earn only a few dozen dollars in an entire year. He observed dinners where deals took shape, relationships were formed, and power was exchanged quietly, beneath polite conversation and controlled laughter. No one taught him these things, but he learned them. This was one of history's quiet contradictions. A boy, stripped of every legal right, was placed in a position to observe how power actually functioned. He did not learn to read ledgers. He learned to read people. He did not study law. He learned how law was bent. Then, when Robert was 12 years old, Emmeline was sold away. She was sent to Louisiana, where she died in 1851. There was no grave marked with her name, no official record, only memory, carried by the son she left behind. After his mother's death, Robert rarely spoke of her. His father never mentioned the relationship at all. This was not only a personal loss, it was a lesson in reality. In this world, everything could be taken without explanation, and yet, something else formed in Robert during that silence. If everything could be stripped away, then the one thing no one could take was the ability to observe, to remember, and to wait. Robert Reed Church grew up without the legal right to exist, but he was accumulating something else. A quiet understanding of how power truly operated in a society designed to exclude him. And the question remains, how did a boy born into slavery, without education, without legal status, turn those silent observations into real advantage in the world of the wealthy? The answer lies where he learned his first lesson about power, on the steamboats, where he was never allowed to sit at the table, but was allowed to see everything. The Church family's steamboats did not merely travel along the Mississippi River. They moved through the entire power structure of the American South in the mid-19th century, beginning in the 1840 seconds. While still very young, Robert Reed Church started working on these vessels. At first as a cabin boy, the lowest position a black child could hold, scrubbing floors, carrying supplies, clearing tables after other people's meals. The work did not give him money, but it gave him position. Every day, the boats left port, carrying cargo, cash, and some of the wealthiest passengers in the Mississippi Valley: merchants, plantation owners, lawyers, politicians, the men who decided who would prosper, who would struggle, and who would never be allowed into the room where those decisions were made. Robert was present in those rooms, but never as an invited guest. He stood at the edges, silent, watching. As he grew older, Robert was promoted to cook, and eventually to steward, the highest position a black man could attain on a steamboat at that time. A steward did more than serve. He managed the rhythm of the passenger deck. He knew who traveled with whom, who paid for whom, who was granted favors, and who was quietly ignored. This is where the story begins to shift. An ordinary laborer sees work. A steward sees money moving. Robert observed how major deals were formed not in offices but at dining tables. He saw important decisions made during conversations that appeared casual on the surface. He understood that very few agreements were sealed on paper, while many were finalized through trust and relationships. By the mid-19th century, a successful transaction along the Mississippi River could be worth thousands of dollars. In today's terms, that would equal hundreds of thousands. At the same time, a black laborer might struggle to earn even $50 in an entire year. The imbalance was not rooted in effort. It was rooted in access. Robert did not have access to capital, but he had access to people. He learned when someone was truly negotiating and when they were merely performing. He learned to identify who actually made decisions and who simply carried a title. He learned that power rarely spoke loudly. It whispered, and only those who listened carefully could hear it. There is no record suggesting that Robert ever received formal business instruction, but everything he witnessed amounted to an unnamed education, spanning years in an environment few black men were ever allowed to enter. And then, something critical began to take shape. Robert realized that money was not created by labor alone. It was created by standing in the right place, at the right time, while the system was in motion. The steamboats carried more than passengers and goods. They carried a lesson Robert quietly absorbed. If he could not sit at the table, he would learn how to control the room. Yet at that stage, all Robert possessed were observations. He had no capital, no legal standing, no opportunity to turn knowledge into action. And the question remained unanswered. When would a man who was only permitted to watch be given a chance to enter the game itself? The answer would come only when the system he had been observing began to tremble. In 1862, the American Civil War reached Memphis. The city fell to Union forces in June, and within days the old order collapsed. Flags changed. Authority shifted. The rules that had governed the South for decades suddenly became fragile, even meaningless. For Robert Reed Church, this moment did not bring freedom in a legal sense, but it removed something else: direct control. The steamboats where he worked were seized by the Union Army as prizes of war. Familiar trade routes were cut off. Former masters vanished from the docks. And at 23 years old, Robert found himself stranded in Memphis, inside a city struggling to redefine itself. He was not alone. News of Union occupation spread quickly through the surrounding countryside. Tens of thousands of black people fled nearby plantations and poured into Memphis, seeking protection behind Union lines. The city's black population surged within a few years, from roughly 3,000 before the war to nearly 20,000 by 1865. Memphis became a strange place: crowded, unstable, uncertain. The economy fractured. The old labor system collapsed. Jobs were irregular. Cash was scarce. No one could be sure who would control the city tomorrow. This was the moment when many chose to leave. Robert did not. He took whatever work he could find: caring for horses, assisting merchants, shining shoes on street corners, small jobs, poorly paid, but offering something he understood well: cash flow, thin but steady. He saved every dollar. There is no evidence that Robert had a grand plan at this stage. But one thing is clear: he understood that moments like this do not last. Once a new order solidified, opportunities for those on the margins would disappear. He bought a saloon. For a man newly freed from direct control, owning a business was rare. But a saloon was not merely a place to sell alcohol. In wartime Memphis, it was where information circulated, where money changed hands, where soldiers, sailors, dock workers, and merchants crossed paths. The saloon became a junction point for everything moving through the city. People came to drink, but they also came to hear news, to find work, to exchange services, to observe who was rising, who was falling, and who would vanish once the new order settled. Robert stood behind the bar, but he was not simply selling drinks, he was selling space. He was selling presence. And more importantly, he was buying information. In a city where the old law had collapsed and the new one had yet to take shape, Robert's saloon became one of the few places where both money and people continued to flow. This was his first success. Small, fragile, but real. And that success placed Robert squarely in the sightlines of forces determined to restore order on their own terms. The question was, in a South emerging from war, how much would a black man who owned property and refused to stay invisible be made to pay for that first step? The answer would come quickly, and it would come through violence. In 1866, the war was over, but peace had not arrived in Memphis. The city entered the post-war period with fractures that had never been sealed. Thousands of black Union veterans returned home, carrying the belief that victory had opened the door to a new order. At the same time, the local police force, largely white and aligned with former Confederate sympathies, continued to control the streets. Two worlds existed inside one city, and they could not coexist for long. In early May of 1866, a minor confrontation between white police officers and black veterans quickly spiraled beyond control. What began as a street altercation became collective violence. For 3 consecutive days, Memphis descended into chaos. White mobs poured into black neighborhoods in South Memphis. Homes were burned, schools were destroyed, churches were set on fire. Contemporary reports indicate that 4 churches and every black school in the city were wiped out. At least 46 black residents were killed. 75 others were wounded. 5 women were raped. 91 homes were completely destroyed. These figures reflect only what was officially recorded. No one knows how many families lost everything during those days. Robert Reed Church was inside his saloon when the violence reached him. Armed men stormed the building. There was no warning, no negotiation. A bullet struck him, and he was left on the floor amid shattered glass and overturned furniture. They believed he was dead, but Robert did not die. The bullet passed through his body, and somehow he survived. There was no heroic rescue, no timely intervention, only a severely wounded man left behind in a city that had just witnessed the collapse of every moral boundary. After the massacre, hundreds of black residents fled Memphis. They boarded trains and headed north, searching for places less openly hostile. For many, the city had made its message unmistakably clear. Robert Church could have done the same. He had the wound. He had proof that this city was willing to kill him if given the chance. But he did not leave. Instead, Robert made a decision few people in his position would dare to make. He stayed in Memphis, not to forgive, not to forget, but to build. After the massacre, his saloon reopened. Business resumed in a city struggling to reassemble order. Those who remained needed places to work, to exchange, to survive. And Robert understood that if power could be used to destroy, it could also be accumulated. His survival was not merely an act of luck, It turned him into a witness, a man who had seen the old order collapse and understood what would replace it if no one stepped forward to build something new. But the question remained: what allowed a man who had been shot and left for dead in a city that had just tried to eradicate his community to believe that he could build power from the ashes? The answer would not come immediately. It would take shape in the years that followed, when Memphis faced another catastrophe, one that did not come from human violence, but from nature itself. In 1878, Memphis faced an enemy that carried no weapons. Yellow fever swept into the city during the summer, spreading rapidly through mosquitoes, though no one at the time understood the source of infection. People only knew that the disease arrived with the heat, that victims' skin turned yellow as their livers failed, and that death could come within days. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. Within weeks, more than half of Memphis' population fled. Roughly 25,000 people abandoned the city by train and steamboat, desperate to escape what many believed had become a cursed place. Streets emptied. Shops closed. Commercial activity nearly stopped altogether. Those who remained witnessed a city dying. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. The stench of death hung over entire neighborhoods. Businesses collapsed in waves. By the time the epidemic subsided in the fall, more than 5,000 people were dead. Memphis was financially and psychologically shattered, stripped of its city charter, and pushed into bankruptcy. Amid this chaos, Robert Reed Church sent his family away to safety. But he himself stayed behind. He remained in Memphis, not to rescue, not to perform acts of heroism, but to observe. Robert had survived violence. He understood that disaster does more than kill. It collapses old values and creates vacancies that new power inevitably fills. As landowners fled or died, properties were sold at distressed prices. As businesses closed, storefronts sat empty. As banks tightened credit, very few people were able to buy. Robert bought. He purchased land, homes, commercial properties. There is no evidence that he acted recklessly. On the contrary, all signs point to a calculated process. Buying when no one else dared to buy. Holding when no one else dared to hold. The sums Robert invested during this period were far below the assets' pre-epidemic values. Many properties sold for only a fraction of what they had been worth just years earlier, and when the city recovered, those values returned. Memphis did not disappear. It survived, and as commerce gradually resumed, Robert Church owned an extensive network of assets across the city: rental housing, business properties, land in strategically important locations. Contemporary estimates suggest his rental income reached approximately $6,000 per month in late 19th century terms. That would be equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars per month today. Robert Reed Church became a figure the Southern social order could no longer ignore. He was not merely wealthy. He controlled space. He controlled cash flow. And more importantly, he controlled the pace of recovery in a city emerging from catastrophe. This was the moment when many began referring to him as the first black millionaire of the American South. Not because of a single deal, but because he had survived every brutal filter the 19th century could impose. Yet, this accumulation of wealth was not merely a personal triumph. The real question was how Robert Church would use the power that the epidemic had unintentionally placed in his hands. The answer lies in his next decision. a decision that would transform wealth into symbol and turn a survivor into a public challenge to the old social order. By the 1880 seconds, Robert Reed Church had moved beyond survival. He entered a different phase, a phase defined by how he chose to appear before society. After the yellow fever epidemic and Memphis' gradual recovery, Robert possessed more than money. He possessed position, and he understood that in a racially segregated society, position was not expressed through bank accounts alone. It was expressed through what others were forced to see. He chose to build a mansion, not just anywhere, but in a white upper-class neighborhood near the heart of Memphis, an area home to the city's most powerful families. It was a calculated decision, because location often speaks louder than architecture itself. The house was designed in the Queen Anne style, the height of elite American taste in the late 19th century. 3 stories, 14 rooms, large bay windows capturing light, a layered exterior of brick and wood, rich in texture and contrast. Inside, mural paintings were created by an Italian artist brought to Memphis specifically for the commission. These details were not decorative flourishes. They were signals. Signals that the man who owned this house understood the cultural language of the elite and possessed the resources to reproduce it. The property sat on approximately 2 acres, an unusually large parcel in an urban setting at the time. Gardens, walkways, auxiliary structures. The estate functioned not merely as a residence, but as a landscape of power. This is where the story turns. In a society that continuously told Black Americans they did not belong in elite spaces, Robert Church's mansion stood as a wordless response. It did not argue. It did not ask permission. It simply existed, and that existence had an effect. Everyone who passed by was forced to see it. Every white family in the neighborhood understood that the house was no accident. It was the result of money, decision, and legal ownership. It forced society to confront a reality it preferred to deny. The house did not merely say that Robert Church was wealthy. It said that he was equal. In late 19th century Memphis, that was provocative. No speeches were required. No declarations were needed. Architecture itself became a manifesto. But Robert Church did not build the mansion solely to affirm himself. He had witnessed too many disasters to believe that personal symbolism was enough. He understood that if power remained confined to a single house, it could be isolated and destroyed. And that was when he began directing his wealth beyond the gates of the mansion. The question is, once he had used architecture to declare his existence, what larger change did Robert Church seek for the community that shaped him? The answer lies in his next move, a move that would transform private wealth into public space and turn a rich man into a social force Memphis could no longer ignore. By the late 19th century, Memphis had public parks, but not for Black citizens. The exclusion did not need to be written into law. Reality made it clear enough. The city's public spaces were designed to exclude. Black families had nowhere to take their children, no playgrounds, no auditoriums for gatherings, music, or civic events. Robert Reed Church saw that absence, and he did not ask the city for permission to fill it. He purchased approximately 6 acres of land on Beale Street, the heart of Black Memphis. The location was deliberate. Beale Street was where commerce, music, and Black social life converged. If power required space to exist, this was the space. Robert built church, park, and auditorium, Not a symbolic garden, a fully realized complex, a public park, a playground for children, walkways, and at its center, an auditorium with seating for roughly 2,000 people. The auditorium alone cost an estimated $50,000 to $100,000 to construct, an enormous sum at the time. In modern terms, this would represent several $1,000,000. There was no government subsidy, no municipal funding. This was private capital used to create civic space. Church Park quickly became the center of Black life. In Memphis, concerts, speeches, community gatherings, all took place in a space fully controlled by Black citizens. No permissions required, no surveillance, no marginalization. No. The most prominent figures in Black America appeared there. Booker T. Washington delivered speeches promoting education and self-reliance within a hostile society. The Fisk Jubilee Singers performed, bringing Black spirituals from church pews onto a major stage. A young band leader named W.C. Handy provided music for events, years before the world would recognize him as the father of the blues. Then, in 1902, something happened that no one in Memphis could ignore. President Theodore Roosevelt came to Church Park and addressed a crowd of approximately 10,000 people. A sitting president, standing in a space built by a Black man, speaking to a community that had been excluded from the city's civic life. This was not a courtesy visit. It was recognition. Robert Church did more than build a park. He built a new political reality, one in which Black citizens were no longer spectators to power, but owners of civic space. And he did not stop there. In 1893, Memphis faced another crisis. The city needed to restore its charter after being stripped of self-governance due to bankruptcy following the epidemic years. Municipal bonds were issued to stabilize finances. Investors were hesitant. Few believed in a city that had once collapsed. Robert Church stepped forward. He purchased the first bond, $1,000. Not the largest sum he ever spent, but the most symbolically charged. A man once shot and left for dead became the first citizen to stake money on the city's survival. The city that had once tried to erase him now needed him to exist. Church Park and the city bond purchase were two sides of the same strategy. One created space for an excluded community. The other forced the city to acknowledge the power that space represented. But power does not end with one generation. The question that follows is how the next generation would use this foundation, built not only of wealth, but of confrontation with the old order. The answer would come from within the church family itself, from those who inherited not just money, but an unfinished struggle. As Robert Reed Church entered the later years of his life, he understood that money was only the foundation. What ultimately determined a community's fate was not wealth, but participation in decision-making. And that was when the second generation of the Church family stepped onto the historical stage. The first was Mary Church Terrell. She was born in 1863, into a family where money was not the obstacle, but social standing still was. Robert Church sent his daughter north for her education, a rare decision for a Black woman at the time. Mary graduated from Oberlin College in 1884, becoming one of the first African-American women in the United States to earn a college degree. She later completed a master's degree. Education did not remove Mary from reality. It placed her directly in front of violence. In 1892, Thomas Moss, Mary's childhood friend, was lynched in Memphis. Moss was a successful black businessman who owned a grocery store that competed with a nearby white-owned business. There was no charge, no trial, only a bullet-riddled body left on a railroad track. The murder marked a turning point in Mary Church Terrell's life. She joined the anti-lynching movement alongside Ida B. Wells, organizing campaigns, writing, and speaking across the country to expose racial violence that white society preferred to ignore. In 1896, Mary co-founded the National Association of Colored Women and became its first president. She coined the organization's motto, "Lifting as we climb," the belief that progress meant rising without leaving others behind. In 1909, Mary Church Terrell was among the small group of black women who signed the call to establish the NAACP, an organization that would later become a cornerstone of the American civil rights movement. She did not simply inherit her father's wealth. She transformed that position into moral and political influence on a national scale. Meanwhile, in Memphis, another figure was preparing a far more dangerous move. Robert Reed Church, Jr., born in 1885, grew up in a world where wealth already existed, but political power remained locked away. He received a formal education, studying at Oberlin College, the Packard School of Business in New York, and training in finance on Wall Street. When he returned to Memphis, Robert Jr. understood something clearly. Without the vote, money remained a hostage of the system. In 1916, he founded the Lincoln League of Memphis. The objective was explicit: register black voters, organize them, protect them from barriers such as poll taxes and administrative obstacles deliberately designed to exclude. The Lincoln League did not merely advocate. It paid poll taxes for those who could not afford them. It opened voting schools. It transformed citizenship into something that could be exercised. Within a short period, tens of thousands of black voters were registered. The numbers were large enough to shift local political calculations and force elected officials to respond. This was the moment when the story crossed a line. Money could be taxed. Land could be seized. But an organized voting bloc represented a direct threat to power. Robert Church, Jr. was no longer simply a wealthy man. He became the gatekeeper of black political power in Memphis, a force local authorities could not ignore, yet could not easily control. And that was when the system began to react. The question was no longer whether this power existed. The question was, who would never accept its continued growth? The answer would arrive soon. It would carry a specific name, and it would bring with it a political machine strong enough to dismantle everything the Church family had built. The power built by the Church family eventually reached a dangerous limit. That limit had a name: Edward Hull Crump. Boss Crump did not appear in Memphis as an ordinary politician. He functioned as a complete political apparatus, a machine that controlled elections, budgets, police, courts, and every pathway to power in the city for nearly 4 decades. Crump understood something essential. Crude violence was no longer necessary. In a modern city, the most effective form of power operated through laws, paperwork, and administrative procedures that appeared legitimate. For many years, the relationship between Crump and the Church family existed as a fragile alliance. Crump needed black votes to maintain his rule. Robert Church, Jr.'s Lincoln League controlled access to those votes. Both sides understood each other, but neither trusted the other. Cooperation lasted only as long as their interests aligned. But alignment is never permanent. The turning point came in the late 1932s. National politics shifted. Informal arrangements began to fracture. Robert Church, Jr. grew increasingly independent, no longer willing to function as a silent intermediary. He advised national campaigns, attended party conventions, and exercised influence beyond Crump's control. By 1940, the alliance collapsed completely. Robert Church, Jr. refused to support Crump's chosen candidate for governor of Tennessee. This was not merely a political disagreement. It was a direct challenge. And the system responded. Not with guns, not with mobs, but with tax records. City authorities initiated selective tax investigations against properties owned by the Church family. Alleged back taxes from previous years were suddenly revived. The legitimacy of these claims was widely disputed. But in a city controlled by Crump, disputes did not alter outcomes. Properties were seized. Assets accumulated over decades were placed under foreclosure and auction. Revenue streams were cut off. The financial structure of the Church family was dismantled methodically. Crump did not stop there. He sent a message to anyone who stood with Church. Allies along Beale Street were targeted. Businesses were subjected to constant police scrutiny. Customers were questioned. Operations were suffocated until survival became impossible. Supporters were forced to leave the city, carrying with them a lesson that loyalty to Church came at a severe cost. This is where the story becomes most chilling. There was no dramatic trial, no public verdict, no images of violence to fill newspaper headlines. Only a web of procedures that slowly rendered everything once legal unsustainable. Robert Church, Jr. understood that the political game in Memphis was over. In 1940, he left the city, not because he lost an election, but because the entire political space available to him had been sealed shut. He relocated to Washington, D.C., continuing work with national civil rights organizations, but he never returned to Memphis to live. The Church family lost effective control over the city they had once helped save. Wealth could be stripped away. Votes could be suppressed. But one thing remained: silent, unyielding. The final physical symbol of the Church family still stood: the house. And the question now is, after the system had crushed people and property alike, what would it do with a symbol that refused to disappear? The answer waits in the next chapter. After the Second World War, Memphis entered a new phase. They called it urban renewal. The language sounded clean, legal, modern, but on the ground, it meant something else entirely. Black, middle-class neighborhoods that had formed around Beale Street began to disappear. Homes were cleared. Businesses were displaced. Communities were broken apart. Residents were relocated into newly built public housing projects, designed according to a logic of racial segregation, separation, surveillance, and control. This was not a planning accident. It was a policy choice. Spaces that had once allowed black residents to accumulate property, build influence, and form a middle class were erased from the map. What replaced them were housing blocks that were easy to monitor, easy to contain, and incapable of producing legacy. In the middle of this process, the Church family's Queen Anne mansion was left behind. It had no owner, no political protection, no surrounding community to shield it. The house stood alone in a landscape being dismantled piece by piece. And then, the city made a decision. The mansion was selected as a training site for the fire department. The official explanation was simple. The building had deteriorated. It needed to be removed, and there was no more practical use than employing it to test new firefighting technology. Everything was legal. There were permits, notices, a schedule, no darkness, no secrecy. In February 1953, firefighters gathered on South Lauderdale Street. Fire engines lined the road. A crowd assembled. Reporters were present. The fire was ignited not to save, but to destroy. Bay windows exploded. Carved wood burned. The murals once painted by an Italian artist vanished into smoke. 3 stories, 14 rooms, a structure that had once served as a silent declaration of dignity and equality collapsed in front of the city. No one was arrested. No one was charged. No investigation followed. Black newspapers called it an act of infamy. One local resident said the scene resembled a lynching, not of a person, but of a symbol. The house was not burned because it was dangerous. It was burned because it still stood. In a city that had erased communities through policy, the house remained the most stubborn memory. It reminded Memphis that a black family had once owned land, wielded power, and forced the system to negotiate, and for that reason, it was not allowed to exist. The fire of 1953 did more than consume brick, wood, and murals. It delivered a message, understood by anyone who had ever seen Church Park, the Lincoln League, or the Black Ballot. Power can be bent, symbols can be erased, and memory, if left unprotected, can be burned in broad daylight. The house fell, but the story did not, and the fact that this fire is still remembered today is proof that some things cannot be completely destroyed by power. After the fire of 1953, there was no mansion left to remember, no brick walls, no bay windows, no Italian murals that once forced an entire neighborhood to look again. But Church Park did not disappear. Years later, the space was restored, not in its original form, but as a place of memory, a place that quietly reminds us there was once a community built with money, with will, and with a refusal to accept exclusion. A statue of Robert Reed Church now stands there, not to celebrate a millionaire, but to remember a path from an unnamed enslaved boy to a man who forced an entire city to reconsider what power looks like. The political machine that crushed the Church family is gone. Boss Crump survives only as a name in history books. The structures that once used law itself to suffocate the black vote no longer rule the city the way they once did. But the idea Robert Church left behind is still here, the idea that ability does not need permission to exist, the idea that dignity does not require approval to be real, the idea that true power is not just money or office, but the ability to create space for others to rise. A house can be burned. What it represents cannot. They burned the house to erase his name, but the fire itself made him immortal. This story is not only about Memphis, it is about every era where power tries to erase memory instead of confronting it. It asks an uncomfortable but necessary question. When a community is removed from the map, what remains strong enough to resist being forgotten? If you want to continue exploring places that power tried to erase, buildings that once stood at the crossroads of wealth, politics, and human dignity, continue with the stories appearing on your screen now. There are details there that may change how you see history itself. Thank you for staying until the final moment. If this story made you think, leave a comment. If you believe it deserves to be shared, press like and subscribe to continue exploring legacies that refuse to remain silent. See you in the next story.